The morning started like any other. Me, my coffee, and the quiet hum of the pine trees whispering outside my cabin. But then came the scream. A shrill, piercing sound that shattered my peace like a bullet through glass. Standing on my porch was this woman, clipboard in hand, waving it around like she owned the place. She looked me dead in the eye and told me to tear down my cabin, my family's cabin, because apparently it was dragging down the neighborhood's property values by a full 12%. I glanced down at the tiny dog barking at her feet, a little ball of fury with more teeth than manners, and the cheap plastic HOA badge pinned crooked on her faded sweater. Just a week later, karma had her number, and I wasn't about to keep quiet. Ever met an HOA Karen like this? Drop a comment. Because I'm going to need all the moral support I can get to tell you the rest of this wild ride. This little slice of mountain heaven was mine by birthright, inherited from my grandfather, who spent decades quietly piecing together this 2,000-acre sanctuary. It was my escape from the endless buzz of the tech world, a place where the only thing I had to worry about was if the coffee was strong enough to kickstart my day. Little did I know that this Tuesday morning was about to rip that piece to shreds. The woman on my porch, dressed like she raided the discount bin, faded sweater, wrinkled khakis, and heels that clicked so loudly on my wooden deck they sounded like a warning bell. But it wasn't just her outfit, it was her attitude. She jabbed a finger at my cabin like it personally insulted her family, all while her chihuahua vibrated with the kind of fake outrage only a dog trained for drama could muster. "Sir, I'm Darlene Pratt," she declared like it was some kind of coronation. "President of Pine Ridge Estates, HOA." She thrust her clipboard at my face like it was a sword, then laid down the law. My cabin violated codes and community standards, and I had exactly 72 hours to tear it down or face legal firestorm. The absurdity hit me like a slap across the face. This woman was standing on my land, wielding threats like a tyrant with no actual power. I tried to keep my voice steady, explaining calmly that this was private property, far outside any HOA reach, but Darlene wasn't having it. She flailed her arms dramatically, insisting her community standards gave her authority over the entire valley. That's when the real circus began. Darlene pulled out her phone and started live streaming, broadcasting her little crusade against me to the internet. She pointed the camera at my cabin, calling it a dangerous eyesore ruining property values, while her dog yapped away, trying desperately to sound like the voice of neighborhood justice. Not satisfied with just a live stream, she marched over to my gate, pulled out a can of red spray paint from a bag that looked like Mary Poppins' purse, and marked a giant X across my gate, declaring my cabin illegal construction destined for demolition. Watching her vandalize my property live, I felt something shift inside. This wasn't just petty HOA drama, it was a direct attack on my family's legacy. But here's where it gets juicy. Instead of flipping out, I found myself caught in a tug of war. Part of me itching to call the cops and nail her for trespassing and vandalism, the other part curious just how deep her madness went. She was filming every illegal move she made. Totally clueless she was building her own case. "Ma'am, you're trespassing and vandalizing," I said, pulling out my phone to record her red hand. Her bravado flickered for a second, just a flash, before she doubled down, puffing up like some self-appointed community enforcer. She promised legal action, county involvement, and even law enforcement. But then, just before she left, she made the move that would be her undoing, calling the cops and filing a false report against me right there on my property, after marking my gate with spray paint. I just stood there, watching, as the madness unfolded, knowing karma was about to come knocking. And knock it did. Less than 30 minutes later, flashing lights rounded the bend up my mountain road. Police cars, serious faces, and all eyes on Darlene's clown show. When the sheriff stepped out, I could tell he'd dealt with her before. He wasn't buying the story she'd spun. As I handed over decades-old permits proving every inch of my cabin was legal, the sheriff's expression shifted from skepticism to relief. The papers were airtight, signed, sealed, and stamped by the county. Meanwhile, Darlene's face cycled through denial, panic, and rage as her fake authority crumbled in real time. That's when I knew. This was more than a battle for a cabin. This was the beginning of the end for the HOA queen, who thought she owned a mountain but had no idea who really ruled the land. The collapse of Darlene's grand performance didn't just stop at the sheriff's cold shoulder. No, it rippled through the whole neighborhood like a stone tossed into a still lake, shaking up every quiet, scared resident who'd felt her heavy hand but never dared speak out. I remember that afternoon vividly. Knocking on Ellie's door, the elderly woman whose garden had been ripped apart by Darlene's so-called community standards. Her eyes were red, and her hands trembled as she showed me the barren patch where roses and lavender once bloomed, a living testament to years of love now crushed by fear and fake complaints. Those emails she'd received, supposedly from concerned neighbors, turned out to be a twisted solo act by Darlene herself, sending phantom voices from her home to bully Ellie into submission. It was like watching a puppet master twist the strings of a broken neighborhood, and for the first time, I realized this wasn't just petty HOA nonsense. This was calculated psychological warfare. But as heartbreaking as Ellie's story was, it sparked something else inside the community, a flicker of resistance. When Tom Bradley, a longtime Pine Ridge resident, reached out that day to warn me about Darlene's plans for an emergency meeting, I sensed a growing undercurrent of frustration simmering just beneath the surface. People were tired of living under her thumb, of being bullied for the color of their mailbox or the height of their lawn. They'd been too scared to speak up, too exhausted by the constant fines and threats. But the tide was turning. I could feel it like a wind shifting before a storm. The question wasn't if this fight would escalate, it was how badly it would hit when it did. Behind closed doors, I was preparing too. My grandfather's old leather-bound atlas lay open on the kitchen table, its faded ink tracing the very boundaries of this valley, this community I was sworn to protect. He hadn't just left me land. He left me a legacy, a responsibility. Every acre of Pine Valley wasn't just dirt and trees. It was a trust, a promise that this place would shelter families, not fearmongers. And Darlene? She was standing on borrowed time, a queen without a kingdom, a fraud wielding empty threats against the rightful steward. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it, her manufactured authority crumbling under the weight of genuine ownership. Word by word, document by document, I built my case. Jenny Collin, the sharp-eyed legal eagle I'd called for help, uncovered layer after layer of Darlene's deceit. Illegal fees, forged documents, secret surveillance, and a protection racket disguised as neighborhood governance. It was as if the woman was building a house of cards in the middle of a hurricane, oblivious to how soon it would all come crashing down. Every new piece of evidence didn't just bolster my resolve, it fueled the community's hope that we could reclaim what had been stolen from us. They weren't just tenants on my land, they were my neighbors, my people, and together we were about to rewrite the story of Pine Ridge Estates. Then came the day of the community meeting. The showdown that everyone whispered about, but few dared to attend. The air was thick with tension, the room packed with faces ranging from anxious to defiant. Darlene, ever the dramatist, played her role perfectly, accusing me of destroying the community, waving her stack of fake witnesses and doctored photos like a prosecutor at a high-stakes trial. But as her accusations echoed, I watched the crowd shift. The skeptical glances, the subtle nods, the whispered doubts. It was in that moment, under the gaze of dozens of neighbors and flashing cameras, that I stood and laid down the truth. Opening my grandfather's briefcase, I revealed the original deeds and lease agreements, the legal proof that I was not the outsider she painted me to be, but the rightful landlord of the land they called home. The gasp that rippled through the room was electric. A collective awakening that shattered Darlene's carefully constructed illusion and marked the beginning of her downfall. The room went from tense silence to a quiet uproar, the kind of noise that bubbles under the surface until it bursts free. Faces that had been skeptical moments before now turned toward Darlene with a new kind of scrutiny, one that saw through her grandstanding and false authority. I could see it in her eyes, the panic rising like a tide about to crash. She tried to argue, to shout, to claw back control, but her voice was just noise against the undeniable proof spread across the table. The papers bore the weight of decades, stamped and sealed, and every signature was a nail in the coffin of her reign. It was poetic justice. The queen of a kingdom that wasn't hers, reduced to a desperate figure scrambling for scraps of power. The irony wasn't lost on me. All those fines and threats she'd thrown around were meaningless because she had been nothing but a tenant playing dress-up in someone else's house. As the crowd's murmurs grew louder, neighbors began standing up, voices shaky at first, then stronger, recounting their own stories of intimidation and harassment. The floodgates opened. People spoke of unfair fines for mailboxes, arbitrary landscaping rules, and threats over trivial complaints, all tactics used to control and divide. Tom Bradley stepped forward, calm but firm, confirming what we all suspected. Darlene had no legitimate authority, and her campaign had been a long-running abuse of power disguised as community enforcement. The relief was palpable, like a heavy fog lifting after years of darkness. This was more than a victory for me. It was liberation for every person in that room who had felt trapped by her tyranny. The collective energy shifted from fear to hope, and I knew the story wasn't just about a cabin or a gate. It was about reclaiming dignity. Darlene's facade crumbled completely when I declared, loud enough for everyone to hear, that she was banned from all community property, from the cabin to the community center, and that any further harassment would be met with criminal charges. The venom in her eyes as she stormed out only fueled the fire burning in the hearts of the residents. The crowd erupted in whispers of thanks and quiet cheers. The power dynamic had flipped, and the air was electric with possibility. But the real change was just beginning. Over the next few days, the story exploded online. Videos of the meeting, her meltdown, and my calm presentation spread like wildfire, drawing sympathy and outrage from communities far beyond our valley. Local news stations knocked on my door, hungry for interviews, eager to tell the tale of the HOA queen undone by her own deceit. But what struck me most were the messages flooding in from strangers across the country, sharing their own HOA horror stories and thanking me for standing up when so many had stayed silent. It was as if this fight had tapped into a universal truth. People crave justice, especially when it's served with a side of wit and a steady hand. And justice it was. Within 48 hours, the district attorney's office filed charges against Darlene: fraud, harassment, vandalism. The full weight of the law bearing down on her. But even as the legal system moved, her desperation grew. Voicemails, conspiracy theories, frantic calls to residents. It was a last-ditch effort to cling to power that was already slipping through her fingers. Then came the night that sealed her fate forever. I was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass and the blaring of my security alarm. Grabbing my phone, I caught sight of Darlene stumbling around my cabin in the dark, her dog barking wildly as if warning her of impending doom. In her clumsy attempt to break in through a window, she tripped over the very creature that had been her sidekick in all this madness, crashing through my flower bed in a tangle of limbs and yaps, the perfect, almost cinematic end to a reign built on illusion and fear. The footage caught by a neighbor's phone was the final nail in her coffin. Within minutes, the sheriff arrived, cuffed her on the spot, and announced charges that no amount of tantrums could reverse. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief. What had started as a quiet fight for peace had turned into a legend of justice, resilience, and the power of standing your ground. Weeks later, as I drove through Pine Ridge Estates, I spotted a banner stretched across the community center reading HOA Zone, with children's chalk drawings mocking the fallen queen. Stick figures chasing Darlene out, smiling families celebrating freedom. Her house sold fast. Neighbors whispered about her retreat into shame and isolation. But the real victory was visible in the laughter and warmth that returned to the streets. Gardens bloomed where once there was fear. Ellie tended her roses with tears of joy, planting memorials that spoke louder than any HOA rule. And as the sun set behind the pines, I felt a deep, quiet pride. Not just in the fight we'd won, but in the community we'd saved, the legacy we'd preserved. and the truth that sometimes the greatest beauty blooms from standing firm against the storm. Months passed, but the ripple effects of that showdown were still unfolding like the slow, steady growth of those roses Ellie planted. The community, once fractured and fearful, was beginning to stitch itself back together, each neighbor reaching out where silence had ruled before. I found myself invited to block parties, garden gatherings, and even informal town meetings where people openly talked about what they'd endured and what they hoped to build instead. The transformation was almost surreal. It was as if the very air had shifted, heavier before, now lighter with the promise of something better. But beneath the surface of renewal, I knew the work wasn't done. The scars left by Darlene's reign weren't just on lawns or in broken fences. They were etched into the trust that holds a community together. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the pine trees sway in the twilight, I pulled out a letter I'd been meaning to write to my grandfather. It felt fitting, after all this turmoil, to share the journey with the man who had laid the foundation for everything here. I wrote about the battles fought and won, about the community that had been tested and found stronger, and told him how his vision for a place where families could flourish had not only survived but thrived, despite the darkness that had tried to swallow it whole. It was a letter full of gratitude and hope, but also a quiet vow to carry the torch forward. Sometimes, I realized, stewardship isn't just about owning land. It's about nurturing the spirit of the people who live on it. News of the victory spread beyond Pine Ridge Estates, inspiring others caught in similar fights against petty tyranny. I started receiving messages from people across the country sharing their stories of HOA battles, unfair fines, and neighborhood drama. Many thanked me for showing that standing up to bullies doesn't mean throwing punches. It means knowing the rules, gathering your evidence, and having the patience to wait for the right moment. It was humbling and powerful to see how one story could ripple outward, sparking hope in places I'd never been. It made me realize that while this was my fight, it belonged to a much larger movement of everyday people reclaiming their rights and dignity. Despite the victory, I remained vigilant. The past had taught me that darkness can linger in unexpected corners, and complacency is the enemy of freedom. So, I continued working quietly with neighbors to rebuild trust, establishing transparent committees and community projects that welcomed everyone's voice. We set up educational programs about land stewardship, respectful living, and the importance of unity over division. Slowly, the wounds healed, replaced by a sense of shared purpose that bound us tighter than any HOA rules ever could. And with each passing day, Pine Ridge Estates felt less like a battleground and more like the sanctuary my grandfather had dreamed of. As the seasons turned, I often found myself back on that porch, watching the sun set in brilliant streaks of gold and crimson, a reminder that even after the longest storms, the world keeps turning, keeps healing. Ellie's garden bloomed wild and free, children laughed where silence once reigned, and neighbors who once feared each other now shared stories over barbecue pits and garden fences. The cabin stood strong, no longer a target but a symbol, a testament to resilience, justice, and the power of standing firm. And though the fight had been long and hard, it left me with a simple truth. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't just won with laws and letters, but with the quiet, unbreakable strength of community and hope. Even as peace settled over Pine Ridge Estates, the memories of the battles fought and scars left behind were never far from my mind. The fight wasn't just about property lines or HOA rules. It was about reclaiming dignity, restoring trust, and honoring a legacy my grandfather had built with sweat and vision. Every flower Ellie planted in her garden, every block party filled with laughter, was a small victory against the shadow Darlene had cast for so long. But healing takes time, and I understood that the true test wasn't just winning the war, it was rebuilding what had been broken. The community had to learn to trust again, to believe in itself beyond the fear and manipulation. That journey was just beginning. I spent countless evenings on my porch reflecting on the weight of stewardship. The leather-bound atlas my grandfather left me was more than a map. It was a symbol of responsibility, a reminder that land isn't just dirt and trees, but a living testament to the people who call it home. I began writing a letter to him, trying to put into words the mix of gratitude and resolve I felt. I told him how his vision had survived the storm, how the families in Pine Ridge were finally free to live without fear of petty tyranny, but I also promised to keep fighting, not with anger, but with patience and wisdom, ensuring that this sanctuary would remain a place of peace for generations to come. Word of our victory spread beyond our valley, carried on the winds of social media, and whispered from neighbor to neighbor across the country. Messages poured in from people trapped in their own HOA battles, sharing tales of unfair fines, bureaucratic overreach, and quiet desperation. They thanked me for showing them that resistance doesn't have to mean shouting matches or court battles. It can be a calculated, patient stand, grounded in truth and unity. It was humbling to realize that our small fight had sparked hope in countless other communities. The power of one story, told with honesty and heart, was more profound than I had ever imagined. But I knew complacency could undo everything we'd rebuilt. So, with the help of neighbors and friends, we started creating spaces for open dialogue and community growth. We formed committees that welcomed every voice, transparent and accountable, ensuring no one could wield power unchecked again. Educational programs sprang up, teaching stewardship of the land, respect for neighbors, and the importance of shared responsibility. Slowly, Pine Ridge Estates was transforming, not just physically but in spirit. The wounds of the past were healing into scars of strength, reminders of what we'd overcome and what we could achieve together. As the seasons changed, I often found solace watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the same way my grandfather had witnessed those mountains decades ago. Ellie's garden blossomed, a riot of color and life where once there had been only bare earth and sorrow. Children played freely, their laughter echoing through the pines, a sound more precious than any silence enforced by fear. The cabin stood firm, no longer a target but a beacon, proof that justice, patience, and community could prevail against even the most relentless storms. And in those quiet moments, I understood that true legacy isn't just what we inherit, it's what we protect, nurture, and pass on. The fight had been hard, but it had taught me one simple truth. Hope, when tended with care, blooms eternal. Even as the dust settled over Pine Ridge Estates, I knew the fight wasn't truly over. Darlene's reign of terror had been broken, but the wounds she'd inflicted ran deep. Fear, mistrust, and the scars of manipulation couldn't be erased overnight. I felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. This was more than a victory. It was a call to stewardship, to ensure that no one else could wield power like that again. Standing firm wasn't just about owning land, it was about protecting a community's soul, and that meant turning pain into purpose, chaos into connection. The morning after the community meeting, messages began pouring in, neighbors reaching out, sharing their stories, their fears, their hopes. I listened, and I realized how many felt powerless, trapped by bureaucracy and bullying that seemed endless. But I told them this: you don't have to fight with fists or fury. Fight with knowledge, with patience, with the relentless belief that truth and justice can win. I started organizing workshops on legal rights, HOA bylaws, and community organizing, arming my neighbors with the tools to protect themselves. The spark of empowerment ignited across the valley, spreading faster than I could have imagined. Our renewed community wasn't perfect. Old wounds took time to heal, and some neighbors remained wary, still haunted by years of intimidation. But with every meeting, every shared meal, every collective effort to rebuild, trust grew stronger. We created transparent committees with rotating leadership, opened channels for honest dialogue, and fostered a culture where questions and concerns could be voiced without fear. The atmosphere shifted from guarded suspicion to genuine collaboration. We were no longer victims, but partners in shaping the future of Pine Ridge Estates. One evening, as I walked the paths between blooming gardens and chatting families, I caught Ellie tending her roses, a symbol of resilience, of beauty reclaimed. She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, as she spoke of hope and renewal. watching children play freely where silence once reigned, listening to neighbors reconnect after years of division. I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what my grandfather had dreamed of, a community rooted not just in land, but in shared values and respect. The fight had forged something new, something stronger, something worth protecting for generations to come. And so, as the sun dipped behind the pines, painting the valley in warm hues, I found myself writing once more to my grandfather, to the future, and to anyone out there facing their own battles. I reminded them that sometimes the greatest strength lies in patience, in knowing the rules, and waiting for the perfect moment to act. That standing up doesn't mean being loud, it means being steady, unwavering, and true. Pine Ridge Estates was no longer a place ruled by fear and false authority. It was a beacon of hope, proof that when people come together, justice can bloom and communities can heal. And that, above all, is the legacy worth fighting for. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.